Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Sheen Center Online. The Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen Center for Thought and Culture is a project of the Archdiocese of New York, and this is our Faith, Hope, and Love series, which is our continuing weekly public streaming content that we offer free of charge while we're not able to gather together in person down at the Sheen Center. Thanks to our friends at the National Review Institute for co-sponsoring today's important conversation. And of course, a big thank you to you for watching. As always, we'd love to hear from you. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the question box, the comment box below. Now, addressing Congress back in 2015, Pope Francis said that our response to the challenges facing us as a nation must be, quote, one of hope and healing, of peace and justice, and that we must, quote, move forward together as one in a renewed spirit of fraternity and solidarity, cooperating generously for the common good, end quote. Now, just how we might do that in facing the many challenges facing us in our current moment, and how we might call for that renewal of spirit as believers, as people of goodwill, and as Americans, is the question posed to our distinguished guests today. And to introduce those distinguished guests and serve as moderator is our good friend Catherine Jean Lopez, Senior Fellow at the National Review Institute, an editor-at-large of the National Review, and author of A Year with the Mystics, Visionary Wisdom for Daily Living. Catherine, take it away.
Thank you, David. It's always a joy to do an event with the Sheen Center, even when they're virtually. And so thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I want to introduce my friends here. Gloria Purvis, who is a radio show host on EWTN. She's an activist. She's a force of nature is what she is. Frequently a speaker and an MC. She's a wonderful MC. The bishops have had her. She's wonderful, as you'll see. And Lewis Brown, who's the executive director of the Christ Medicus Foundation. He's a lawyer. He's worked in government as well as the nonprofit sector. And so we're going to talk today about a little bit of everything that is driving uncertainty, driving anger, and even despair. We hope that after this conversation, you'll walk away with a little encouragement, because both Gloria and Lewis are people I turn to for encouragement. They have wisdom. They're people of prayer. And they live in the real world, and so I think you'll enjoy this conversation. I hope it's both challenging and, as I said, encouraging. Maybe a little bit of a rallying bit for us. So do we have everyone here? Here we go.
Yeah. Yes.
Great. I wasn't seeing people probably on my screen, so I wasn't sure here. I'm like, oh, where am I talk for an hour? That should be. So, Gloria, let me have you start.
Okay.
And you're both very busy people. Everyone watching is a busy person. I always appreciate the time. So, Gloria, I mean, oh goodness. People, it seemed like we were all a little on edge even before coronavirus started.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The anger, the loneliness, the despair, all of this, right? How have you been taking this all in?
So when the coronavirus first, well, let me back up a little bit and just give, because I'm an African-American woman that grew up in the South, and I'm used to being mindful of the things I can and cannot do just for my own safety, trying to read the room, if you will. Is this a safe place? And not always being able to do the things that I want to do for my own safety. So when the coronavirus hit and we were all told we couldn't do the things that we want to do for the safety and life of our neighbor, I was like, okay, I can do this. I can quarantine or be in a temporary cloister on behalf of my neighbor. I can wait for masses to be public on behalf of my neighbor, because it's not that the grace of the masses weren't happening still. It's just the mode of participation of the laity changed. And so I took everything as, okay, the Lord is asking me to show, do I really love my neighbor? I think he's trying to get our attention. So I received all the, what people saw as the shutdowns and maybe losing of their liberty as a way for me to use my liberty for the good, to willingly take, wear a mask, to social distance, to do all these things with in mind love of my neighbor. And so I knew a lot of people were like frustrated and angry and didn't feel like this stuff was real, like, this was a hoax. And I'm like, even if it were, right, how is that going to lessen my stance in front of the Lord if I embrace these things motivated by love of neighbor? And so I had a very different view of it. So I was like, this is an opportunity to love and to offer up my sufferings to Christ. And I thought, the Lord is calling us all to repentance. He's got the entire world stopping. And so I see this as I see it now as an opportunity for us rather than some terrible curse or punishment. And so that is why maybe I don't feel hopeless or angry about it. I'm like, yes, Lord, let me carry my cross and glorify you.
Before I give Louis the floor, what do you say, Gloria, when someone hears that and says, well, for Pete's sake, you shouldn't have had to feel like you were restricted growing up, right?
Yeah.
And so I immediately want to right that wrong, right? Which is a lot of what we're seeing right now, which is a very, a good intention and a good. How do you approach that, process all of that? Because obviously unjust, right?
Well, it's just the world that we live in, right? And so all I can do is continue to move forward in the circumstances that I'm in now. Yes, always seeking justice and desiring it, but also embracing this cross and offering it up for the conversion of myself, as well as people who also need converting, which is pretty much all of us. Mm-hmm. And so not seeing it as a wasted opportunity. And I guess I don't go around like with all this rage or anger about that's just the way the world is. I am more hopeful. And I believe we can change this world if we really have the will to do it.
One of the wonderful things about you, Gloria, is there's no, there's no sugarcoating. There's no pretending that you haven't suffered, that, the world is perfect, because it isn't. You don't pretend. But yet you have joy. And you can talk to anyone, is my impression too, at least what I've seen of you over the years. And it's been a number of years now. Yeah. So thank you for that joy that you bring to the world.
Oh, sure.
And Louis, similarly, just to start out, how do you process all of this coronavirus business on top of, as I alluded to earlier, the uncertainty and anger and just sort of the madness that seems to be a little intoxicating or contagious in our culture today?
Yeah, it's, Catherine, I think, as you know, and I know Gloria knows, it's been tough, right? It's been really tough. First you have a virus that is serious, and I know people that have died from it. It is a serious thing. But at the same time, I think you had a hysteria around it that was not commensurate with the medical realities of what we face, right? And that was tough. And folks were deprived of their faith community that they normally have. Of course, you can pray at home, but the fullness of their faith community. Also deprived of certain communal and familial bonds, and that has been challenging. And then in the midst of that, you have a lot of, a fair amount of loss of life, which is really tough, and some close calls, which is really, really tough. A lot of suffering there. And then we've seen at the same time, millions of people losing their jobs, losing their livelihoods, which there's a human suffering and pain there. But there's also even deeper in suffering where you have increased domestic violence, increased abuse in the home, even suicides. I know of a friend who is connected to someone who committed suicide, not that far from where I am, in part because my understanding, because he lost his business. That's really real, right? And then as we are seeing, as we're all collectively experiencing this deprivation of family, this deprivation of community, this deprivation of faith, plus the economic loss, we have what happened with Mr. Floyd. And it is really a diabolical cocktail, a lot of suffering. But it's a time for us more than anything to recognize that we need God. And it's a time for us as Americans, regardless of our color and our background, to come together in solidarity with each other on all of these issues, to pray together, to love each other better, and to safeguard each other and our human dignity together in ways that we haven't before. We've taken for granted a lot of what we've been given. We need to more fully realize who we are as Americans, recover our identity, and walk further ahead in solidarity to safeguard each other's both in spiritual ways and in ways that we can as people of faith, but also in structural ways when it comes to the healthcare system, when it comes to our criminal justice system, when it comes to the politics in the United States.
Well, Catherine, I think one of the things, as I listen to Lewis, my spirituality is that of a Carmelite. And one of the things that Holy Mother, St. Teresa of Avila, talks about is detachment. And so having been in the spirituality for a while is to be very much understanding that not to be attached to anything in the world, right? And so I'm not blind to all the suffering, because I think suffering's been there before, actually, before the pandemic. It's just that now that we're not as distracted, we are given an opportunity to share in the suffering that we normally were maybe ignoring because we were so busy with our day-to-day lives, but now we all have it, right? But there's something freeing in saying, okay, you can take this and that, all these things can happen to me, but I still have God. I still am a daughter of the Lord. I still have a purpose. And how is the Lord inviting me to love in this deprivation? How can I still love him? How can I still follow him? How can I love my neighbor? So, those are the things that go through my mind. And then let me add, it wasn't just George Floyd, because I remember we first had Mr. Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, then Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and then George Floyd, which the entire world saw because we had it on video. And the ugliness of evil was just made right there in front of us. And we had nothing to distract us, We didn't have our long commutes. We didn't have all these things. And we just had to sit with it. And I know for me, seeing that, it was a trauma, honestly. It was a trauma, and it made me call out to God in the name of God, please stop, is what I was thinking when I saw this violence. But it also made me say, what is the Lord telling us about how we treat our fellow human person? And what is he inviting us to do now that we all see it and can't look away from it? And so these are the things that I'm pondering and wondering about, like everybody else, I'd imagine.
Well, you talked, Gloria, about systemic racism being, to borrow what Lewis just said, demonic. It's a diabolical.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think this is an invitation, to the extent that we can accept it, from God, to realize, we all are, as you said earlier, Gloria, we're all sinners.
Yeah.
And so it's not like we can. It's insufficient to point to Thomas Jefferson or whoever statue you're taking down today,
right?
Because we all share in this. And how for a culture that in many ways I think just kind of can sometimes do lip service to religion. How do you start to introduce this concept again? That we're all this means something.
How do I introduce which concept again?
That we are Christianity itself. That we're all sinners who are in need of supernatural help, right? In this.
Well, I think when we see the brokenness of the human person acted out in the George Floyd situation, A lot of people, when they talk about racism, they think it only affects Black people. But I want to say it has a negative impact on the white community as well. In the sense that I think it deforms the capacity to love that God has given them, right? And it harms the human family. We're both victims of this great evil. And so
Right.
together, working together, we can expel this demon. Prayer, fasting, acts of reparation. You know, I was so moved when I saw Archbishop Cordileone. I think he was doing prayers of reparation or an exorcism over this statue that had been spray painted or something. And I thought, oh my, that's the new freedom ride we need to do. We need to Catholics across this country go to sites of where there's been great evil, like George Floyd's. I would love to take a group of Catholics there. We pray prayers of exorcism there. We could get and go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and pray for that evil that happened there. Rosewood, Axe Handle Saturday in Florida. All these places we can take our faith and bring it into the public square and say, we cast this out and we want to build a community of love, but it's going to take hard work. It's not just that the praying and the whatnot. We have to undergo some interior conversion. We can't point over there and say, oh, they've got to do it. No, we've all got to do it. And we all have to take a difficult look at ourselves, because my sins contribute to the world falling away from perfection as God intended it. And so if I want a world in which there is more love, I have to do the work of the conversion, right? Interior conversion leading to exterior love. That's what my hope is. And for people who are believers, and there's so many of us, we should have that approach, I think. We should see all of our flaws and failures as God's invitation to overcome them by asking for his grace and help. And I'm under no illusion that, oh, this is rainbows and unicorns and going to be easy. It's going to be hard, and we're going to have great opposition against it by the enemy of the human person, and he's going to try to sow division among us. But we cannot be distracted, and we have to move forward. And I say this as a woman of faith, and I say this with great hope, because I know this is what the Lord wants from us. And so with that, that's how we can have the courage to take that first step to what seems like an impossible end, but we will get there.
And you know, you mentioned it's not going to be easy work. All one has to do is look at that crucifix behind you, to remember what it takes. You know, it is intense, and he never promised anything else, right?
Yeah.
No, Christianity isn't rainbows and unicorns or some kind of magic tonic, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But it makes sense of everything. And Louis, you've written beautifully about the new civil rights movement and really the armor of love that we really have to take on. What does that look like? How is that even possible when people are burning things in the streets, and you know what social media is like, and family members are talking to one another because of politics and all of these things?
Right. Yeah. So I think there's three thoughts here, and I love what you just said about the reparation and the spiritual dynamic, because there's real supernatural power in that. It's absolutely vital. I recall watching a powerful piece. I've spoken about this a little bit before, that came out in December. It was called A Hidden Life, about Franz Jagerstadt, who was a martyr because he refused to take an oath of allegiance to the Nazi regime and Hitler back in the 1940s. And there's an incredible line, I believe, in the film, amazing, beautiful film, in which the narrator, which I believe it's in the voice of Jagerstadt, that the townspeople had forgotten who they were. They had forgotten who they were. Mm. So it is absolutely vital for us as Americans. We can't act until we know who we are. If I don't know who I am, I don't know what to do. And so we have to recover our identity for the overwhelming majority of Americans who are people of faith, who are Christians, that we are all sons and daughters of God, made in the image and likeness of God, and that we all have equal human value. That's number one. As a aspect of that, it boils my blood when someone when you see an African-American man or a man of any color, and he is clearly murdered, and people want to talk about his rap sheet. or people
Yes.
is in his his blood alcohol content or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. Murder is always murder. It's always evil. It's always a crime. It's always immoral. So we have to remember who we are, that we want to love, protect, and suffer for all of our brothers and sisters all of us who are American. That's number one. Number two, we really have to, and part of that is prayer, right? In terms of recovering our identity, it's got to be through prayer. But number two, we have to safeguard as an aspect of that. We remember who we are, but then we say we're gonna come together and the love your neighbor. Gloria is exactly right. Come together, right, to do that both in the healthcare realm and take appropriate responsibility, particularly for those that are immunocompromised, for those that are poor and the vulnerable, but also balance that with an understanding that that there's also human carnage as we shut down and discerning through that, going through that, understanding all of that. But the same thing when it comes to criminal justice reform. That can't wait. We have to pray through it, but these reforms that are clear, police officers that shouldn't be on the force, policies that really undermine having a criminal justice system that really protects the rule of law for everyone. Those things need to happen quickly, hastily, because if we don't do that now, number one, we know it needs to happen. Number two, if we don't do that now, people will be unjustly impacted. The last thing that to your question, Catherine, is this new birth of civil rights. The civil rights movement in the United States of America is incredible. The founding, a lot of good things happened, but a lot of flawed things happened. Abolitionists came together. We know that was largely a movement based on Judeo-Christian principles. It led to the Civil War, but without that abolitionist movement, without the Great Awakening of faith throughout the country, wouldn't have happened. We know what happened with the Civil Rights Movement, largely a Judeo-Christian movement of change. Much of that movement has been hijacked by forces that want to break down the rule of law, want a different country, that really want to advance the culture of death. We have to reject that hijacking. We have to reclaim what the civil rights movement was, which is a movement founded on the dignity of every person, on religious freedom, on the right to life from conception to natural death. We have to reclaim that, and we have to do it now in every sector, whether it's public health, whether it's criminal justice reform, every sector in America. And there's ways that we can do that, which we can go into later. I think one of the lessons that we can take is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was done after apartheid in '94. It wasn't perfect, but the truth came out. Victims let it all out. Perpetrators confessed their crimes and their sins. Healing occurred, some level of healing occurred, and significant civil and racial unrest was staved off. We need that now in America. You, as I wrote in Public Discourse, you can't heal as a person when you've been wounded if you don't deal with your woundedness. We have never dealt with our woundedness here in the United States of America. We change the law and just try to move on. Clearly, that's not working. And so that's some of the work that we as people of faith can do in our churches and in other forums. It's vital that we do that now.
Well, Louis, with that said, though, we still have people denying that any wrong has been done and that there are any lasting effects of things that we know have happened, not just during slavery, but after slavery, during Jim Crow.
Right.
And I mean, for goodness sake, let's look at what just happened in Scottish yesterday. The Know Nothing movement from the 1840s, with their bigotry against Catholicism, led to the Blaine Amendment. And now 180 years later, just about, we're finally dealing with it. So, I mean, if people can't see that even in that case, how over a century to try to write something based off of some bigotry against Catholics and immigrants a long time ago, why do they think that we don't have to deal with some bigotry and hatred that happened to African Americans a long time ago? We have to deal with it. And by the way, the Blaine Amendment didn't specifically say XYZ Catholics. It said sect and sectarian, which was code for Catholic. So on its face, you might think it's neutral. We have those same kinds of issues to deal with policy-wise and law-wise in the United States, but people don't want to admit that there is still work to do. People have said to me, "Oh, there's no law that specifically, it discriminates against African Americans," and I was like, in intention and in enacting it, it most certainly has been the case. But until we can get to that place of being honest about that and talk about that and come together and say, how can we change that? I don't know that we can take that next step that you're talking about. We have to admit that, yes, there's a problem that we haven't yet dealt with, not only spiritually, but also to try to unwind these things in policy and culture and all the things that make us look at a human person as less than. And when you talk about that example of George Floyd, of how people wanted to bring up his rap sheet, it reminds me of the same tactics that you see in the pro-abortion movement that's done to the child in the womb, of how dehumanizing the child in the womb, instead of dealing with the fact that this is a member of the human family. And so by doing all those things with George Floyd, talking about his rap sheet and, you know, he's not a martyr and all this kind of stuff, and, you know, but I hope his family gets justice with a nod and a wink. What they're really doing is, you know, to me, calumniating the Black community and detracting against this man that was murdered in a way so that it will diminish our capacity to have empathy for what happened to him and to want justice, right? And to love him and to still remember he is a member of the body of Christ. And I think that fundamentally is a problem that we see in dealing with things of racism. If the person hadn't been Jesus in their past life, oh, forget him, throw him away. And that's precisely
and that's part of the
right?
culture of death, right? It's not the same as abortion, but that's part of the culture of death. You don't, there's something that you've done, that you've committed, that therefore you do not have an equal right to life.
Right.
What are you talking about? That just never, it's ridiculous. It's ludicrous. It's not, it's antithetical to those of us who are believers, those of us who are Christian. It's antithetical to who we are as the United States of America. It's not going to work. It's not what you do in a constitutional republic that's based on the inalienable rights of man. It doesn't work, and it has to be called out.
And these rights of man come from God himself, right? And so that's why I keep saying these things are demonic, because it's so irrational. When you look at it, you're like, who in their right mind? I mean, how could you come to these conclusions that because of previous past actions, somehow a person is less than and should be brutalized, that this is the way you have to deal with that criminal element, so to speak. And I'm like, this is not who we are as believers. We need to come with our voice to the public square and demand change for the good of all of us. And this is why I think what we have as believers is so valuable in making our republic one that is fair and just and truly respecting of the rights of all citizens and human persons. So
if I could extend on that, Catherine, I agree very much with you, Gloria. Something that's hard for a lot of folks to understand is that, you know, the Civil War ended 1865. Pretty close after that. I took a phenomenal class in law school that was taught by a former, attorney that he's passed away since, but he had litigated at the Supreme Court. If you look at what was going on in Mississippi, if you look at what was going on in Louisiana after the Civil War ended, there was basically an ongoing insurrection, right? After Reconstruction ended, the Union Army pulled out of the South.
Yes.
Police departments coming together with white supremacist groups to terrorize African Americans in the South, that in ways that really didn't end until the 60s. That's a few decades ago. Okay. Then in the North, right, it was better, obviously, but extraordinary hostility, restrictive covenants that restricted African Americans from living in certain neighborhoods, and everywhere from Boston, Chicago, Detroit, New York City. Then you had police departments with extraordinary hostility, particularly to African American men, in ways that continued, I believe, in large scale until not really in the last maybe 10 years. What I did, my first job out of law school was at a law firm in Michigan. We represented the city of Detroit in their labor bargaining with police unions. This is only about 12, 13 years ago. At the time, the Detroit Police Department, which was an overwhelmingly Black force, I don't know if it's predominant, was under a consent decree with the Justice Department. That was 12 or 13 years ago for civil rights abuses. This is still an issue.
Yes.
I do think at the same time, Catherine, what's very important is that we have a situation that is probably, when it comes to the racial division in our country, that's not as good as it should be. there's still problems. There's vestiges. There's remnants. We've made massive advances since the 60s, massive advances. And so at the same time, so we still have an issue. It needs to be healed. It needs to be dealt with. But we should not pretend that it's 1965 Philadelphia, Mississippi throughout the United States of America. That can give cause to outsized anger. It can give cause to a frustration, a desire for revenge, a hatred that is evil. The rioting and the looting, ways that we call out our white Americans, our white brothers and sisters throughout the country in ways that I don't think are of the Lord, and ways that I don't think are appropriate. We have to reject that too. So we still have a massive problem that we need to deal with in the United States, but we have to reject a temptation in some corners for revenge, to act out in violence, to do the rioting, the looting, the vandalism. That also needs to be rejected. That's part of the culture of death too.
So I would say when we look at, while we might say it not like the 1800s, it's not like 1960, it's still not good enough.
Right.
And I want people to understand in no way is Lewis saying that we ought to settle. We say, oh, it's not as bad as it used to be. As long as we are not treated and received as the sons and daughters of the king, we're going to keep pushing, because that's how we should be seen. And so even to the degree that things like people were upset that the Aunt Jemima was taking away on the soap, I was like, that's a part of the cultural representations, the social conditioning to make people see Black people as merely subservient and less than. And so to the degree that these kinds of images that lead to the social conditioning that really don't portray us as full human persons goes away, I think that's a part of the good thing. That those are, because it doesn't prop up the lie that we're less than. You know, it's a part of this is also looking at the representations of how people are presented in our storytelling, in our marketing, and all these things. Is this something that's helping me to see them as a human person, or are they still something that's sort of you know, this simple-minded servant that only cares for me and has no care for her family or anything like that? Because when you read and study up on the Aunt Jemima trope and all these kinds of things, it's really a problem. And so seeing that go away, I don't miss it, because I'm like, good, maybe there can be something now that's more, where we can see the Black person as a full human person with their own mind, their own agency, if you will. And so I think that's a part of some of the cultural change we'll have to visit, as well as policy and law, as Lewis was talking about. But I think sometimes we're even blind to it, because it's like drinking water or like breathing the air. It's so natural that we don't even understand the social conditioning that has made us to not see each other as brothers and sisters, as equals, and as worthy of the things that we're asking, you know?
So, Lewis, I'm going to ask Gloria this too after you speak to it. So, how do we have an honest conversation about our experiences and what's unjust, and how we can truly see people, see one another as creations of a loving Father, right? How do you go about that in a constructive way, in the knowing the way the world is right now?
For me, Catherine, that comes back, and I'm sure for Gloria too, and she spoke about this earlier, it comes back to the fact that by the grace of God, I have some level of self-awareness. I know I have sinned. I know I have failed. I know that I have contributed to a country that's not as much as it could be, because I'm human, because of my failures and my mistakes. And that's true about me, but it's true about all 300 million of us. We have all in some ways fallen short, contributed. And so part of what we know as Christians is the ability to examine our consciences, right? Dr. King talked a lot about examining our consciences. And so to come into this humility, to understand that we have contributed to having an imperfect union, as we talk about in the United States, but that we can come together to work towards a perfect union, and to give other people some mercy. As someone said, I can't recall the last couple of weeks, maybe it was Pat Lencioni, I think, talked about it. Give folks, he was talking about folks in his household, but give folks some grace. Give them some humility, not to do things that are sinful, evil, or immoral, but give them some grace that we're all human and we've all contributed to the struggles that we're in some form or fashion. And I think that's vitally important. We also really need to know, Catherine, as I think about the pandemic, if this is okay, if I can go here a little bit, as I think about COVID, we need to understand that there's a lot that we don't know, right? That we have our life experience, but other folks have their life experience as well. And so the Christ Medicus Foundation is highly concerned and is really devoted its whole mission to religious freedom and the right to life in healthcare, sharing the love of God with people in healthcare, particularly for communities of color, particularly for folks that are vulnerable, particularly for folks that just don't have access to medical care like they should, which is part of the right to life. And so African American communities really struggled and are struggling with COVID-19 for a lot of reasons, but part of it is that we don't have access to medical care that we should have. For a lot of reasons, we haven't built up the cultural awareness around health and wellness, or because of economic limitations, we're not, a single mom or a family that's under a lot of stress is able to build up their health and wellness as they should. And some of that's that legacy of discrimination. Some of that's that legacy of racial discrimination, and some of those deprivations, things that our communities in different places, whether it's Detroit or New York City, certain levels of health, wellness, access to medical care that we didn't have access to, right? A lot of people don't know that. Or you think about food deserts, right? You think about nutrition. Someone close to me in Anacostia in DC talks about how it's so hard to find a grocery store. In Detroit, there were hardly any grocery stores in this massive American city until several years ago, within the last 15 years. And so you look at that, is that a grocer or a businessman or a hospital executive say, no, we don't want Black people getting healthcare? No, that's generally not what's going on. But it's these built up deprivations over decades that has really hurt those that are economically less well off, and particularly African Americans that haven't had access to certain social goods over time. We need to fix that. And so that's part of what we're dealing with, whether it's COVID or the issues of police misconduct. That's part of what we're dealing with. That's part of the work of building up a civilization that's based on love, that's based on justice, like St. John Paul II called us to do. That's part of the work that we have to do right now. But we have to realize there's so much that we don't know.
Before I go to Gloria, Louis, I just want to say, what do you say to someone who, you began speaking about your own sin and in such a position of humility? What do you say to somebody who I'm sure has said, but I'm sure this has been said to you, you've been unjustly treated. You should not have to ever say you're sorry. What is your response to that kind of understandable thinking?
That I should never have to say I'm sorry for
because there are such injustices against you as a Black man in America.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You look at the pro-life movement, okay? Regardless of denomination, people of faith are very used to coming together to pray, to fast, to march, to make reparation for the sin of abortion, which is horrible and evil. Even though the overwhelming majority of those folks have never committed an abortion, have never encouraged someone to commit an abortion, has never participated in one. In the same way, I think that there's certain issues that we deal with as a nation, as a country, that pains my heart, that even though I may not have directly contributed to it, I want to participate in the reparation. I want to participate in the renewal. I feel called as an act of love, even though I'm not directly responsible, or maybe even if I'm a victim of it, I want to heal. When I see, as Gloria talked about this, and someone that Gloria and I both know has really inspired me on this, that sin, racism, immorality, division, violence, that hurts the victim, but it also hurts the perpetrator. Both are wounded, right? And so when I see someone that is wounded because of their own sin, my heart breaks, partially because I know I've sinned in other ways. And so I want to be part of that healing balm, particularly for the victim first, I think, because justice demands it, but also for the perpetrator so that they can be healed because they're a victim of their own sin. They're a victim of the fall too. There's been some deprivation of love. So much of what we are in right now, we can understand by the presence of love or the deprivation of love. All of us have experienced that. That's how we can kind of come together and say, hey, we've been there together. It doesn't mean false equivalency, but it allows some level of humility and, again, some desire to say we all are in need of healing, but in different ways.
You know, Liz, you just kind of perfectly described why I just have no tolerance for the death penalty. And I know this week, part of the news is there are like federal executions happening again. And you know, I can't look at any person who's done evil and not realize something awful had to happen in their lives that contributed to this. Now, that's not to excuse or say that we shouldn't have prisons, you know, but you know, so many of these stories we hear of people on death row, they were abused in the most horrific ways, right? I mean, honestly, I looked at and like Gloria, I can't even think about that video of the killing of George Floyd without tearing up, and it was so revolting. And you just gotta wonder what on earth has gone on in that police officer's life that he could do that to a human being, you know, that he could so dehumanize a man. And I just, Gloria, how do we get to the point where people can just take a few steps back from all the talking points, the preconceived caricatures, whatever it is, to actually just have this conversation about human beings and trying to help them in the limited time we all have here, right?
So I've seen a lot of conversations where people say, I am not guilty of this or that, and I will not feel sorry for this. And I'm like, only sociopaths don't have guilt. What are you saying? You know? And so I often think sometimes that's the Lord trying to prick our conscience, you know, to have us turn toward doing what is right. And if we could just let down our defensiveness, like I didn't do anything wrong, or I don't want anybody to say this or that to me, let that down, you know, and realize that what we need to do is let go of all that defensiveness because we want to surrender it to get to a place where we can have something better, right? And I was reading again for the millionth time, The Way of Perfection by St. Teresa of Avila. And in her book, she's talking about she's talking about her sisters in the convent. She says, if you see another sister publicly doing something wrong, right, a vice, you are to practice the opposite virtue of that vice. And we can do that as well. When we see that the ugliness that we saw with the murder of George Floyd, what is the opposite that we can put into practice? And I would say it's to love the human person. And people sometimes say, well, you know, there are more abortions than Black people getting killed by the police. And therefore, I was like, could you stop with that? This is not a competition. Just because there are challenges, it doesn't mean that we're to be less loving. We're to be more loving, more pro-life. That's like telling me if I have more children, I'll love my other children less because I've got more of them. God gave us the capacity to love more, not less. And besides, we know how to walk and chew gum. And so I think sometimes we also allow ourselves to be caught up in the politics of it instead of the gospel of it. Right? So let not our guide to this be any political party. Let our guide be Jesus. And also, let's take our sins to the confessional. Let's ask the Lord, why is it that I have this interior disposition toward these people or whatever it is? And ask him to heal us of it. Ask him to show us our brokenness. And he will. If you pray and ask him, he will show it to you. And you take that to the confessional and you continue to take it to the confessional until you're purged of it, right? And then you have to pray and you've got to do the difficult work. And so many times people are like, I don't want to make any mistakes. That's your ego and your pride there. Forget about it. Sometimes you're going to fall on your face trying to follow him. Get up, brush yourself off, and keep it moving. You know, the more we cannot look for honors in this world, the freer we are to serve him, the freer we are to make fools of ourselves and trying to love the Lord. He's going to help us. And so I think we have a lot of interior checking to do ourselves as well. And as Catholics, boy, I think we're so blessed to have the sacraments and the spiritual aid, the prayers of the saints. And by the way, in terms of reparation, I have started trying to gather people who are willing to do this work together. So if anybody's interested in doing this reparation together, because remember, by these sins, it is God himself who is chiefly offended. So if we could get together, if anybody's interested, they could email me, blackcatholics4, that's the number 4, life@mac.com, blackcatholics4life.com. So we can get together and start to do this work, okay? And realize that it's to God himself that's chiefly offended. And we need to come together as brothers and sisters of the Most High and do this work of loving each other and making reparation to the Lord. And trying to be humble about that and not being deterred and think that, oh, we can never do it. He's inviting the world, I think, to repentance. I don't think any of these things happening now are by accident. And the question is, how are we going to respond? And I think as Catholics, we are perfectly suited to respond in a way that could bring about actual change in the world.
Gloria, you and Louis have both talked about reparation and in a way that we don't normally talk about reparation in the wider culture, right?
Right.
Why is this so important to you? And what do you even mean by it? For anyone who's wondering.
Well, we have broken our common home by our sinfulness. And reparation, we understand reparation to the Sacred Heart for the sins, reparation to back up. Why are we not doing reparation to God for the sins of what we've done to each other, particularly in this area of race that we've never really addressed spiritually in this country? We can put all the laws and all the things that we want, but until we have a conversion of heart, there is not going to be peace among us. And so I understand that. Now, let me say, the Catechism does not say that if there is financial reparations, that there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. So I don't want people to think that I'm saying, oh, that is not an answer as well. What I am saying is that right now, at this moment, we have a means of making reparations to God to bring about a more just earth, really, the world. And I think it's naive of us to deny the real power in that, but it requires us to acknowledge our sins and be willing to do it. And it makes me think of the Martyrs of Compiègne, whose feast is coming up this month. They were the nuns that were beheaded, right? And they knew that they were going to be offered, if you will, make a sacrifice, an oblation of their lives. They just didn't know exactly how. And the way they went to the guillotine is so beautiful, and how they offered themselves. And they said that within a week, the guillotine was no more in France. The love of the offering of themselves slayed that demon. Are we willing to love in that way? Do that, what they call I would say, a violence of love, but a violence of love that brings about renewal. It tears down the old evil and it brings out a renewal and a rebirth of what is good in our community. But we have to be willing to follow Christ in that way, no matter what the cost is, and without fear. But it has to be motivated for a love of him, right? So I think when we have all these things in that way, we're taking the right steps. And it's possible, it's possible, it's possible. I have hope, and I know it is possible. We just need to make the first steps.
One of the things that scares me a little bit about this time is that I think Gloria is absolutely right. A priest friend of mine talks about how this is a Carmelite moment, being locked up in your homes and the poison Gloria. But then, a lot of people are watching Netflix, and we have virtual events, and there's a lot of stuff coming at people at the same time. We have to look like we're productive, so we keep our jobs, and all of these concerns that people have. Of course, the liquor stores being open and the churches not being open, right? All of these different factors. What Is it too late for us? Louis, what is your thinking about next steps?
Yeah, if
Particularly if one feels like they've wasted this time,
no, so if you're yeah, if someone's watching this, the time is now. Robbie George said at the New Evangelization Dinner here in DC, probably about a year ago, for those that are watching that are Catholic, that the era of comfortable Catholicism is over. For those that are Christian, if they ever thought otherwise, the era of comfortable Christianity, it's over. The same thing if for our brothers and sisters who are Jewish and people of faith have to wake up. What Gloria said is exactly correct. And as a mentor of mine has said, this is all comes down to a massive problem of hearts, that hearts need to be healed. As I read in a phenomenal book recently, a book by Alexander Havar, Virtuous Leadership, highly recommended. Knowing that someone is a human being often is not enough to love them. You need to know that they are created and made in the image of God and therefore deserving of love, that they come from love, him or herself. Part of this renewal that we need in the country is civil rights, but what comes before that renewal of civil rights is that renewal of the love of God, our freedom as people of faith, the religious freedom that we desperately need to unleash that power of love. That love is the most powerful force. It's not violence. It's not hatred. It's not anger. It's not burning. It's not looting. It's obviously not the misconduct and brutality to try to do illegitimate protection of streets. It's the force of love. We have to unleash it. It has to be unleashed. And so that's an issue of our hearts, right? And so we do that heart work for those of us that are watching. And then we look for opportunities in the public square. If you're involved with their church, start working on doing communal forums where people can come to a greater level of understanding, where grievances can be aired, where healing can happen. If there's an issue with your police department, be engaged. If you're a healthcare professional, look at ways that we can do a better job, either at your hospital, with your county health department, of taking care of the poor and the vulnerable. If there's an opportunity to set up a Catholic, Christ-centered, or faith-based community clinic in your neighborhood, do it. We need to be looking at, both from the COVID situation and from this issue of police brutality, of ways of, again, unleashing this force of love through structures that will be there in a systematized way, on an ongoing way, that take care of the poor and the vulnerable, and that really demonstrate the sharing of the love of God with every person. I even think about police officers. Some friends of mine and I, the overwhelming majority, we know the overwhelming majority of police officers are good people. I think they're largely heroic. I think to say that it's just a few bad apples is really kind of naive. It's more than that. There's a lot of issues. But police officers have been, particularly the good ones, have been beaten up during this period. A lot of these guys, especially the good men and women, they're suffering. They're suffering. If you look at the verbal pummeling that they're taking a lot of times when they're guarding different monuments and all of that, that does damage. That does emotional damage. It does spiritual damage. It does psychological damage. There needs to be healing there. So we need a renewal of love. We need a rebirth of civil rights. We need a renewal of religious freedom so that we can do this work. And if you're watching this, whatever sector of society you're in, if you're in education, if you're in healthcare, if you're working at your church, if you're at a restaurant, whatever it is that you can do to breathe out the love of God, to make it a structural change, to make it a systematic change, we need that now. If we don't do this work now, we may not have the same country a year from now. And I've never said that before. This is not about the election. I'm not talking about the 2020 election. I'm saying that this, what we've gone through isn't as bad as 1968 if you look at lives lost and destruction, but the bonds that bound us together, as bad as things were in 68, faith, family, knowing who I am, knowing that I'm loved by God, those things have been seriously threatened and diminished. We're not as strong in certain ways in terms of our identity. If we don't do this work now, if we don't wake up right now, we may not have the country that we love, that we want to perfect, that we know right now, that we believe that can be resurrected. We may not have it. It has to happen now.
I have to say, I gushed a little bit about you, Gloria, at the beginning, and I want to gush a little bit about Lewis right now. One of the things I miss about normal times is whenever I was in DC, particularly, I would always run into Lewis at church, at Mass, adoration, and confession lines. And I have to say, and you just exude wisdom as well as joy, both of you. And I'm grateful, so grateful for you, Lewis. I'm so grateful for you, Gloria, and I think people listening are too. In fact, there's one Carmelite priest who's listening, Gloria, who's particularly grateful for your Carmelite chat. But I also have to thank you both for the focus on confession and prayer and trauma. One of the things I keep thinking about, well, first of all, you talked earlier, Gloria, about the sacrifice of not going to Mass, not going to the sacraments for the good of others, right? We wanted to protect others. We didn't know what was going on, so we couldn't do this right away. And I know one thing that I kept being drawn back to is I was never worthy to receive the Eucharist in the first place. And so thanks be to God I ever had that gratuitous gift from God, and never take that for granted. And I will walk over hot coals to go to confession, that's for sure. And I think we can't, especially now having, had to live without it for a period of time, which I never thought I would have to do, right? We live in the Northeast, for Pete's sake. When was that ever going to happen?
Right.
Back in our comfortable times, right?
Right.
We cannot, as the two of you have said, we cannot do this as Catholics without confession. We cannot do this without prayer, and we cannot do this without loving one another. And the other thing I keep thinking about is the support groups that help people, right? What is that all about? Listening, right? Listening and walking together, right? That's what we've got to do here, right? And so we have like 2 minutes before I have to give it back to David. Gloria, can you say some parting words, and then Lewis, and thank you.
Do not despair. We have hope. We know the kingdom of God said the gates of hell shall not prevail against us. I always saw that as us going in and snatching people out who
Amen.
might be in the grips of the devil. I always see that as we can go in and snatch them out and bring them back, right? And so we need to have hope. We need to remember whose we are. We need to remember that the Lord wants us to do this. We've got our guardian angels. We've got the saints in heaven. We've got our sacraments. We've got God himself that wants us to bring about a loving change in our world. And so we have to hold on to that and remember that. And also let us not be, as St. Teresa of Avila would say, let us not be troubled and disturbed, right? We have to have hope and belief in God, and that's our rock. And that's what we stand on when we're in the storms of life. Hold on to that. And every day that we have a breath is your God giving you another chance. So everybody's like, oh, I missed all this stuff. You have right now. Okay, use it. Because this is a gift from God that we have this moment. And so just have hope. We can do this.
Lewis, parting words.
Amen. Spirit of God, not the spirit of the world. You are loved. You are endowed with an eternal inheritance. You are given that. And that will never be taken away from you, number one. Number two, let's come together in solidarity. Pray about it. Figure it out. And number three, let's give birth and rebirth this movement of civil rights. Unleash the power of love. It has to happen. And if we don't, we won't have the country that we love. So it's possible. All things are possible in him.
Amen.
Thank you so much. God is with us all the time. A number of years ago, I did a 30-day nation retreat. And one of the things that, you go through the cross, you go through the passion, you see its connections to your life. And the one thing, all the crappy stuff that happens in life, God is there. God never abandons you. And
yes.
And if we can communicate that to people in whatever terrible, miserable, unjust situations they're in, I mean, that's what our lives are about, aren't they? Thank you so much, Gloria. Thank you so much, Lewis. Thank you, everyone who's listening. David, thank you to the Sheen Center for the opportunity to co-sponsor this with the National Review Institute.
Oh, no, the pleasure's been all ours. You know, just listening to you all, I had the privilege of interviewing a young playwright that we're hoping to produce in the spring. And she quoted Dr. Martin Luther King. And I believe he said that we're either going to learn how to live together as brothers and sisters in Christ, or we're going to die as fools. And that really just seems to echo so much of what you said. And, you know, I often have to moderate some of these conversations, but you know, you use the word gift from God. It was just such a gift for me to be able to sit back and listen to you all. It was so beautiful, and the idea of unleashing that love. I think it was Mr. Rogers who said it, that you know, at the root of everything is either love or the lack of it, and it's just so. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, Louis. Always thank you, Catherine. In one of those conversations I had, we mentioned a quote from James Baldwin, and he said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but you can't change anything without facing it. And I want to thank you both for sort of showing us the way that we can face these challenges with joy, with self-examination, with empathy, solidarity, wisdom, a recognition of that sacred dignity that is imprinted in each of us. And most of all, facing those challenges with faith, hope, and love. So a huge thank you on behalf of the entire Sheen Center for this conversation. Please know you're always welcome back. Hopefully one day we'll be able to do it in person.
That'd be nice. That'd be nice.
But thank you for being here, and thank you. And also thank you to our viewers. You know, if you value this type of conversation, I know we certainly do, and we're committed to continue to bring you these types of conversations and events. But we can't do it without your help. And I strongly encourage you at this critical time to consider making a donation to the Sheen Center. And no matter how small the gift, it makes a huge difference. I invite you to check out all our content at sheencenter.org and to join us next Wednesday for our next streaming event. Until then, stay safe, be well, God bless.